I'd like to also point your attention to, if you haven't joined or haven't considered looking at the Facebook Evidence Management Community Forum. The goal here was just to create a space to build community for evidence managers around the country to find answers to your questions. And you post something there, hopefully someone in your state is going to see it and be able to respond and help you with that. Even if you don't have a Facebook account, it might be worth it to get one just for that Facebook community forum. We also post documents and resources related to this training class online so that you can find those things there. So hopefully that'll be a resource to you. Again, if you have any questions, you can reach me or you can check out our website at evidencemanagement.com. That's where you will find past sessions to this training. They should be available 24/7. It takes us a couple of days to get things uploaded. Like this session will be online and available on the website, just probably not today, maybe not even tomorrow, but soon, and very soon it will be there, probably
Very soon.
Monday. Yeah. So today we're going to talk about two things, and they're two pretty huge topics for evidence management. And I probably should also say that we've decided to cut one piece of the training. We were going to talk about evidence facilities and security and safety. We may be able to get to that next week. We'll play it by ear, but I really felt it was more important to spend more time on evidence disposition and then talk about these special topics like guns, money, and drugs. Because those are things you're going to have as just baseline knowledge. So that's what we're talking about today. And again, free training isn't free. There is a cost, just not to you. And this training is possible because the people at Tracker Products think that this kind of training is important. They make evidence software or evidence management software. I would highly encourage you to check them out at trackerproducts.com. And I'd also like to kind of get back up on my soapbox. If you were here earlier, we mentioned local representation, and that is so critical to the success of any evidence custodian anywhere. Right now, there are only 11 active property and evidence associations throughout the country. And when I started teaching, I realized that's a problem. We need evidence organizations like CAPE, like TAPE IT, like, and I always pronounce this wrong, the New Mexico Property Evidence Association, NIPIT. We need organizations like that everywhere because you can't replace just the community of evidence custodians in a local region because your state is going to be different than your neighbor's state. Things are going to look different in Oregon than they do in Texas. They're going to look different in Virginia than they do in California. And because those states have associations, there is a resource. We kicked off a meeting last week in Minnesota, really excited about the potential of working with folks in Minnesota about forming or reforming an association in Minnesota. And that's just, for me, that's just fun stuff. The more we can do, the better. That's why we invest resources and time in that direction because it's worth it.
Yep.
I'd also like to, after we finish this online training, at the same time, each week, every Thursday, we're going to continue, as long as the quarantine exists, we're going to continue a series of podcasts where we dig a little bit deeper into specific topics. And we're going to call that the Evidence Show. It premieres June 11th, 2020 at 2 o'clock Eastern. If you're already signed up for this, you don't have to sign up again. But I think we're going to cover some ground that we haven't been able to cover in training, stuff that we normally don't get to. So those are our plugs at the beginning. Let's talk about our agenda today. We're going to talk about evidence disposition. We're going to finish that discussion, and then we'll talk about special considerations in evidence. What do we do with currency evidence? What do we do with firearms evidence? And what do we do with drug evidence? And again, at the end, there will be a question and answer session that is optional. If you finish the class and you don't want to hang around for the questions, you're under no obligation. Well, heck, you're under no obligation to be here whatsoever. So you're certainly under no obligation to check out the question and answer session, but we're not going to cover any new ground in the question and answer session than we are in class, except for perhaps clarifying some things that we've confused you on.
Yeah.
So again, if you want the class notes, now that everybody is here online, those are available in 3 different locations. You can find them on the Facebook community forum. Those were posted yesterday. You might have to search a little bit for that. There is a link on the webinar control panel where you can find the notes for this session. in the webinar control panel right now, even as we speak. And you can also go to evidencemanagement.com and find them on our website behind the client side. So your instructors today, again, this is a much younger version of James. This is a much happier version of me.
Nice.
My contribution to the COVID crisis was to buy a motorcycle, and I'm oh so much happier as a result. So let's talk evidence disposition. Uh, One of the things that is really critical to kind of grasp as a concept with respect to evidence disposition is the disposition ratio at your agency. Some of us don't know what our ratio is. We've never heard of it, but a disposition ratio is a great key performance indicator. And if you want to learn to speak the language of police executives, which is the language that you've got to learn to speak if you're going to get things resourced for your unit, key performance indicators are a great thing to measure the performance and workload of your operation. And one great key performance indicator is a disposition ratio. Now, the ideal ratio for any law enforcement agency, this is kind of a holy grail number because very few of us actually achieve this. And it is mathematically possible. I've seen agencies accomplish this 1 to 1. One item comes into your property room and one item goes out. That is the ratio. That is the ideal ratio. And I'm going to show you here in just a couple of slides why that ratio matters and why it's important to you. But I will say, just mathematically, the minimum effective ratio is one item coming in per 0.75 items going out. And I'll show you mathematically again in the next slide why this is important. This is a mythical operation, and it's got lots of numbers here, but they start out with 8,000 items in their property room, and they take in 1,000 items a year. They dispose of 1,000 items a year. And you're not going to be able to see what I'm pointing at with my finger, but if you look at your screen, 6 years from now, in 2025, this agency is still at the exact same capacity they were before. And that's because their intake to disposition ratio is 1 to 1. You're always going to have a certain percentage of evidence that you have to keep. It's always going to grow slightly or ebb and flow slightly depending on the type of cases that you get in over the year. I mean, some cases we know we're going to have to keep forever and a day or effectively forever, like homicide cases, especially with unsolved homicides. Those are going to stay around forever. We can't necessarily do anything about that, and we have to keep that evidence. So we want to keep enough room in our unit or in our vault to accommodate new cases and create space for new evidence coming in. We use 80% as a capacity level. You don't want to go over 80% of your capacity. If you are, you run the risk of running out of room. But you can see at a 0.75 ratio, one item coming in to 0.75 items going out, after about 6 years, your capacity has increased to about 95%, which is not ideal, but it's not terrible. On the next slide, I'll show you what happens or what can happen when you dispose of evidence at much lower rates. So in this case, they started out with the same 8,000 items. They dispose of evidence. The one item comes in, a half an item goes out. At the end of the first year, they're at 85% capacity. And in 4 years, they're out of room. They're at 100% capacity. And that's a pretty short time frame when it comes to evidence intake. Now, obviously, this is not a mathematical certainty. We can't determine what package sizes come in and go out. So it's more of a principle and a concept than it is an absolute certainty. But look here at one item coming in for 0.25 items going out. So in 1 year, you take in 4 items of evidence, you dispose of 1 item. That's a 4 to 1, roughly a 4 to 1 ratio. Within 3 years, you're going to be at or above your maximum capacity. So the point here in the illustration is if you dispose of evidence efficiently, your capacity, your storage capacity remains flexible and fluid. If we don't dispose of evidence appropriately, then we're going to fill up at some point, and we're going to need more space or more people in order to solve the problem. And space and people are two commodities that most police agencies just can't, at the drop of a hat, find more of. So it is really critically important to pay attention to disposition and to make that a routine part of your operations. Now, dispositions fail or disposition processes fail because there are a couple of important critical failure points for disposition processes. In many agencies, and I just sent an email to someone in Palo Pinto County today about the disposition process. And one of the things that she mentioned was that the deputies in that jurisdiction aren't a part of the disposition process. And that is a huge issue with respect to dispositions. In many agencies, if you've got a culture that is kind of the submit it and forget it culture, an officer drops something in the inbox and they never think about that evidence item again, that submit it and forget it culture is toxic to evidence management. It is counterproductive. And really, I can give you some good business reasons here in a slide or two as to why that is bad for business for law enforcement, not just for evidence managers, but it's bad for business for police investigators to have a mentality of submit it and forget it. I learned the hard way. Hopefully, you can learn from my life lesson that I learned as a result of a drug case that was going to federal court. I still wince when I think about it. But the disposition failure points are pretty common. When you look at just research and authorization for dispositions, if you're an evidence manager and you're doing all the research and obtaining all the authorizations and all the approvals, then the funnel for the flow of dispositions out of your agency stops down at you. Or if it's a 2 or 3 person unit and those 2 or 3 people are responsible for all the investigations, authorizations, and dispositions, then it stops with those 3 people. But most of us work at agencies with more than 1 or 2 people. The more people you have involved in the in the research and authorization process, that funnel becomes wider and wider and wider. I would go as far as to say if you don't have officers involved in your disposition process, you're just never going to be sustainable as an organization when it comes to evidence disposition. It just can't happen unless you've got the support or a support network of an extremely large evidence operation. That's really the only way to go about it. You need more people at some point working on the problem. So when you look at a normal normal disposition failure point, you look at available time. In a 50-person department, this imaginary department, let's call it Lower Cletusville, Texas. There's 50 people working at this police department. They try to dispose of 1,000 items a year. That roughly results to 12 and a half weeks of research and 12 and a half human hours or personnel hours spent on research and disposition. You got one evidence custodian there, and they do all of the work. So that's going to take roughly 26% of their time. But if you look at all the time at that 50-person department has 2,400 manpower weeks at their disposal. So you multiply it when you involve officers in the disposition and approval process, you multiply your ability to dispose of evidence because you can identify and authorize the disposition of evidence much more efficiently than you can if you're doing it by yourself. So how do we start the conversation? If you work at an agency where the officers are part of that submit it and forget it culture, I mean, one of the reasons I do what I do is I want to see culture change across the industry. I want to see a lot of things change with respect to evidence management, not only kind of esteeming and appropriately valuing evidence managers, but I want to start new conversations. Police officers should be involved in disposing of evidence. They should be involved in authorizing the disposal of evidence. And one great business reason to take to your chief is quality control. If you've got an officer that files 20 dope cases a year and all 20 of those get thrown out in court because the investigation is ineffective for whatever reason, that officer's or that investigator's work product is not satisfactory, he will never know that unless he knows the conviction rate of the cases that he or she files. It's the same with DWI or any type of criminal case. Officers need to know how effective they are as investigators. The only way to find out your effectiveness is to know the adjudications of the cases that you filed. So instead of talking to the chief and saying, hey, the cops, the patrol guys don't want to do anything, they're lazy, they're terrible people, that's never going to resonate with anybody. But when you bring the chief a different conversation, hey, chief, do our officers know how effective they are when they file cases? We need to do some quality control measures here. One of those quality control measures could be knowing the adjudications of the cases that you file, whether it's as an investigator or an officer. That's a great business reason that extends beyond evidence custody, and it really extends to the effectiveness of you as an organization. Another reason is for liability. Um, when you communicate to a chief or a police executive or anyone up the chain, there is a liability consideration with not having officers and investigators actively involved in authorizing the disposition of evidence. That places all the liability on you as the evidence custodian or whoever authorizes that disposition. And I can promise you that if it's not the investigator, if it's not the officer that's involved with the case, somebody's going to make a critical mistake. I know this because I've done it, and it was related to a federal dope case, and I still kind of don't like to think about it, don't like to talk about it, but I do here because it can be useful for you, a cautionary tale. We had a state case, a state drug case involving a lot of grow lights. And as an evidence custodian and supervisor of evidence custodians, I grew to hate grow lights with the white hot intensity of 1,000 suns. It just made me angry to look at them. It made me angry to see them every day. So as soon as I found that the statute of limitations had run on that case and they weren't going to file a state case, the first thing I did was toss all those grow lights and toss the evidence associated with that case. Because at that time we had a custody and we had a practice of investigators not being involved in the disposition authorization process. So I got rid of everything because the case was adjudicated. That was our practice at the time. It is a wrong practice, I assure you, because about 2 years later, one of the narcotics guys came in and said, "Hey, Sarge, you remember that case?" And I said, "No, I do not." And he said, "Well, it was the one with all the grow lights." I do remember that case. "Hey, well, that's going to trial here in about a week. I need some stuff for that case." And I said, "We don't have that case because we threw it away." And that is a terrible, terrible position to be in, a cautionary tale that hopefully you can learn from, but it's going to happen if officers aren't involved in the adjudication process. And the third is just the laws of physics. I mean, you don't have enough time to do the work that you need to do if you're doing all the authorizations by yourself as an evidence manager. Police chiefs understand these concepts when we frame them in quality control, when we frame them in the language of liability, when we frame them in the language of physics. Those are things that police chiefs can do something about and topics that resonate with them. So that's a little bit of a soapbox. When it comes to disposition essentials, evidence management personnel, evidence custodians, we act as custodians and caretakers of stored evidence. We should not be the ones that are responsible for approving and authorizing the disposal of evidence. That should be the direct responsibility of a case investigator or an officer. That should be the direct responsibility, I'll say it again, of a case investigator or the submitting officer. And the reason for that is they are the subject matter expert on that case. And if they're not, they ought to be. If that burden is placed on you as an evidence custodian, it's going to create the premature disposal of evidence at some point in the history of your agency. It's going to happen. Now, there are instances like where we should provide limited authority for dispositions like found property or things that are established in law based on law that this evidence shall be disposed at this time frame based on this criteria. I mean, perfect example that would be found property. I mean, we don't necessarily need to get investigator authorization on found property because most laws or most states, there are laws that govern the disposition and the time frame and the requirements for those. But on criminal cases, I can't underscore or state enough how important it is to have investigators involved in that process. One thing that's important to have an effective disposition system, one of the critical components is that you have some kind of established threshold mechanism for dispositions. Now, that might be different for guns and money and drugs and general evidence, but either some type of mechanism, whether it's based on the capacity of your storage or it's based on a calendar. Quarterly, we do drug dispositions. When we fill up this shelf, we do a disposition for general evidence. I mean, I prefer calendared uh, disposition work time that is just dedicated and set aside for evidence disposition, because if it's not on a calendar, if it's not on a schedule, it's just simply not going to happen. That's just been my experience. It's not going to happen until it becomes critical or becomes a problem. So we recommend some kind of threshold mechanism, whether it's based on a calendar or based on capacity. It doesn't matter as long as you hold to it. We also recommend that you designate specific time, scheduled time, whether it's every week or every month or every day, to spend on evidence disposition. If you don't write this into your schedule and have this as a part of your workflow and your work process, other things are going to come up and take that time away from you. And most of us probably work in agencies where we are the single evidence custodian, and we probably might work alone. And if you think about the time that we have or you have every year, a full calendar year is 2,040 hours. Well, when you net out all the holidays and other fun things, training, other opportunities, we're basically working with 1,800 hours every year. And if we've only got 1,800 hours every year to do what we do, and that's assuming that you're a full-time position. There are many of you out there that do evidence part-time, half-time, 25% of the time for your entire agency. So the math just becomes smaller and smaller and smaller for you, but we have a very limited amount of time. We need to use that time wisely and capture as much of that as we can for evidence disposition, or bad things are going to happen. Not terrible, catastrophic, monstrous things, but you're going to fill up and you're going to have issues related to storage that will cause long-term problems for you. Couple of procedure recommendations for evidence dispositions. And there is a resource. I didn't post it on the webinar here, but it's on the website. I'll just call your attention to it again. On the website, evidencemanagement.com, I've got 2 documents that might help guide you with respect to disposition processes. I've got a procedure that covers dispositions, and I've also got a research guide so you can teach officers how to research cases and how to properly document cases so that you can multiply your efforts. But when it comes to disposition itself, I make the strong recommendation that 2 people are present to process and prepare items for disposition. If you work in a shop by yourself, I would strongly recommend trying to find a way to have someone else to work with when you're preparing items for disposition, because of the accountability and the liability that is attached to disposing of items. We strongly recommend having witnesses or documented observers, preferably third party observers or independent observers, witness your disposition processes, witness the disposition processing, or at the very least, IP cameras recording the disposal process so that your integrity can never be impugned. If everything that you do is observed or documented by a witness or is recorded for posterity in video that can be recalled, any aspersions or any wrongdoing, not only will it be caught, I mean, I'm not worried so much about being caught, I'm worried about documenting the integrity of the process and in protecting your integrity and your credibility as an evidence custodian. Video does that. I know that when I first started as a police officer, it was before the days of in-car video, and not much before because I'm a very young man. But it bothered me when we had video cameras. Well, I don't want to have a video camera in the car. That was one of the 7 dumbest things I've ever said. Because a few years later, I was involved in an incident that was captured on an in-car video, and it exonerated me. It protected me from liability. It protected my career because it was captured on video. So I'm a huge proponent of recording everything on video. Body cams are amazing. When we go in and do audits, one of the things that we're working on implementing is having body cameras for the auditors that work for me or work with me, and wearing body cameras the whole time that we're in a room, because there's no replacement for real-time video recording of our work product. And in terms of accounting, this is probably the most critical element of the disposition process. If you could do this and make sure that you do this forever and ever, amen. Never mark anything disposed until it's actually been disposed. Now, you'd think you wouldn't have to say something like that, but I can't count the number of times I've found items in the property room where I worked that had been marked as disposed. Yet lo and behold, they appear at an inventory or they appear at some other point down the road. Well, they couldn't have been disposed. They were just marked as disposed. So it's incredibly important that we not mark things disposed until they're actually gone. Um, Another concept that I want to talk about really quick when it comes to dispositions, there are a few disposition types that we're going to talk about. Uh, you want to make sure that when you do a disposition, that item never comes back home to your property room and never comes back to haunt you. And there are two ways to accomplish that. A lot of agencies do repurposing or converting items to agency use. It's one of my least favorite things in the world, uh, because that stuff is always going to come back. And the way you throw things away is important. Taking markings off, taking evidence markings off from the packages is important. We'll talk about that in just a second. So there are a few ways to dispose of evidence, a few final dispositions. Returning things to the owner is the penultimate. If it belongs to someone, give it back to them. Physically destroying and disposing items is an alternative. There's an option. Auctions or sales are an option. Donations are an option. And then converting to agency use, those are all considered final disposition methods for evidence. When it comes to physically destroying evidence and disposing of evidence, we want to render those items to a condition that prevents future use or sale. When it comes to biological or drug evidence, those are great prime candidates for incineration. I know of a few agencies out there with drug evidence that do something a little different, but the ideal is incineration. I recommend the removal of associated identification, packaging, and labeling from items prior to destruction, especially if it's something that you're just putting in the trash or a refuse bin. Simply because if you put something in the trash and you don't remove the labeling, it can always be associated with your agency as evidence, and it's a weird thing to have that come back to you after it's been found in the dump 5 years from now from someone digging in the dump. We also recommend disposing things. If you're going to throw them in the trash, put them in a secure refuse bin or recycling container that is locked. And that way people don't dig through the trash. Believe it or not, cops love to dig through trash cans when they know stuff is in there. That can be of zero value. It doesn't matter. They still just love to dig through trash cans. Um, when it comes to auctions, there are a couple of things that and this will be included in your notes. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on auctions. There are a few things that you need to do to protect yourself. You need to have good policies and procedures established. You want to identify or remove all identifying information. If you have a practice of auctioning electronic items or cell phones, I would use extreme caution there because we want to make sure, especially with computer CPUs, that we remove all physical identifying information from those. It is very difficult to attest to. It can be done. Just make sure that's a provision of what you do. And then you want to make sure that you have a provision to where that stuff, if you send it to auction, it never comes back. Uh, that is probably the most important because for us, the most important thing about evidence disposition is getting it gone, disposing of the item. Having it come back to us is counterproductive. When it comes to conversions, again, this is sketchy territory because so many agencies back in the 80s and 90s, and maybe I don't know if this was a deal in Southern California, James, but when big screen TVs first came out, it seemed that we had just acres and acres of flat screen TVs that were seized from drug dealers. Uh, we can buy those ourselves now. We don't need to seize them anymore. But really, I don't know what those flat screen TVs ever proved about drug sales. It was just a way to get TVs for police departments and done under the guise of seized evidence. I'm not a big
Yeah,
fan. But that could
absolutely.
just be my soapbox. I might be wrong there, but I just believe that conversions are really problematic, mainly because they're quasi disposed. It
Yeah,
I know that when we had flat screen TVs converted to agency use, when those TVs broke, guess where they came back? My door. And if the TV was broken, no longer serviceable, I mean, we removed the identifying information from it, but they knew it was a converted item, so it came back to me to throw it away. Like, well,
Yeah.
why don't you throw it in the trash? Well, it was converted. It's a problem. If you
Yeah.
do conversions, make sure that you keep a record and some other identifying mechanism to know the items that have been converted, the items that are in your inventory that are converted, and audit those items annually, because it's just the right thing to do. It's being transparent with the resources that we're seizing and awarding. Uh, I would exercise extreme caution with that. We recommend any items that are being approved for or processed for disposition be stored under high security conditions. Dispositions, disposed evidence is the most vulnerable evidence type for pilfering or theft or people poking around where they don't belong, taking things that don't belong to them. We want to store this stuff under high security conditions, higher than we store our general evidence. Um, as far as disposition prohibitions, I make a policy recommendation that any agency employee should be prohibited from possessing, retrieving, or otherwise obtaining evidence disposed of by the unit unless it's acting in an official capacity related to a converted item that is authorized and documented. We don't want to be in the business of having officers dig through trash cans and find stuff that we've thrown away, or even bidding for stuff on auctions if we auction stuff after the fact. There is the very real apprehension there that it could be, I mean, that there is less than transparent things going on with respect to evidence disposition. And again, never documented as disposed until it's disposed. So let's talk money. When we talk about money, and this is section 2. I was going to take a short break, but I realized there's nowhere to go. But we're talking currency. I'm talking about paper bills or anything used as coinage or bonds, things that are issued by a government. Bitcoin exists. Bitcoin is a currency, but we are not talking about Bitcoin here. We're talking about currency and coinage issued by a government here today. Anything used as a fiduciary or financial instrument that is used as a medium of exchange can also be considered currency, but we're talking specifically about paper currency or coin here today. I don't sell these devices, but I promise you they will make your life so much better if you have a currency counter at your agency, at your disposal. It will make you happy. It will bring you joy. It is a purchase that keeps on giving. Again, I don't sell them, but this is the model on the right side of the screen is a Cummins jet scan. It's specifically designed for law enforcement. Um, it is an amazing and beautiful creation. Any money counter or coin counter is going to make a markable or a marked difference in your operations. These I just love. I know personally, I have counted with an independent person, counted the same amount of currency wrong the same way twice. We both counted it wrong the first time, and we agreed with each other that was the count. We counted it wrong the second time, and then we agreed that our mistake was caught and accurate. And then the third time, we put it through a cash machine and realized we were both wrong. And currency counters can eliminate so much of that. Another fun thing that they can do is automatically stop and spot counterfeit currency. They'll kick those out. Not only do they do that, they take numbers of all the bills. They fold it. It's just a beautiful, beautiful process. I would recommend everyone have like 5 or 6 of them just because they're so amazing. But I don't sell them. I'm sure there are others out there. It's just I know that that's the one that tugs at my heartstrings. We didn't have one like that, but it does so much for you. Now, why is currency evidence such a big deal? Well, currency evidence is a big deal because of integrity implications. When you think about the integrity of your agency, when you think about your own personal integrity, if you steal a penny, you're a thief. If you steal $1 million, you're an exceptional thief, but you're a thief nevertheless. So the apprehension or the allegation that you have taken money inappropriately, whether it's a penny or $1 million, impugns your credibility and destroys the integrity of you and your agency. And most of the time, it's an honest mistake. It's officers counting money wrong. It's not that they're taking money or doing anything untoward with it. It's a mistake. But when we make those kinds of mistakes in the environment that we exist in, it impugns our integrity and it's just not worth it. That's why we put in these safeguards and practices with respect to currency that are stringent, because this has value. Also, when dealing with currency, it's important to remember that you're dealing with people's money. You're dealing with their property rights. There are constitutional implications and property right implications with respect to seizing currency from humanoids or from citizens or anyone, residents, whoever's here. There are constitutional implications to that seizure. It's also important because there's value. I mean, there's literally face value. That penny is worth 1 penny. A dollar is worth $1. But there is also the potential of evidentiary value or forensic value for those items. There's always the potential for theft or misappropriation. That's why we put into place pretty strict and stringent uh, guidelines with respect to currency, just because of all that's at stake. I believe that there are only 5 legitimate reasons to submit currency to an evidence room, and only 5. Um, if you can find 6, I'll put 6 down. But I believe that there are only 5 legitimate reasons for any government agency to submit currency uh, to an evidence room. And I know that as an agency, the agency I worked for, we would take money from people and put it in evidence. But when we take money from people, when the verb seize is used as a verb, it's worthless. A seizure is a legal proceeding uh, that is based on requirements that are established in law. That's one of the reasons to submit currency as evidence when seized as forfeiture property and accompanied by documentation filed with an appropriate court. That's one reason. Reason number 2, when that currency or coinage is known or believed to be stolen. That is an appropriate reason to submit currency. Number 3, when it's known or believed to possess forensic value, linking a specific person to a specific place or a specific crime. When there is a known or a believed nexus between that person, and it's not just this guy had $600 in his pocket and he had a nickel bag of weed, that doesn't link him to any crime. That's not a linkage there. Number 4 would be when found or abandoned as non-evidentiary property, or for safekeeping on behalf of a known owner. Those are the 5 reasons. Any reason outside of those 5, I would be extremely cautious about allowing officers to submit evidence or currency evidence to you unless it falls under one of those 5 guidelines, because of the constitutional implications of that act. If you can find a 6th, I'm wide open. I've not had anyone in the last 2 years provide an adequate 6th reason, but I'm wide open if you can think of a 6th. And send me an email, please, because I can't read that tiny screen. So, currency submitted to the evidence management unit should always be counted by denomination and verified by a second person prior to submission. Now, there are a couple of exceptions to that, but generally, 99% of us work in operations where we could have a second person verify the count of the money. It's incredibly important. It protects the submitter, it protects the agency, it protects the evidence unit. That's why we require verification. Now, one exception to this, and if you're interested, reach out to me offline because we don't have enough time to cover it in today's class. One exception to 2-person verification are dope units that follow the DEA protocols for seized currency. This is a completely separate type of process. I don't know if y'all use this out in Orange County, where under video, they bag up all the dope and take it directly to a bank. That is a great way to do it if you're running a narcotics unit and have a process procedure already prescribed for you. If you work with the HIDTA task force, that is a great method for seizure, because it allows the bank, an independent arbiter, to be the counter of money. But with that exception, there are very few reasons not to have 2 people verify the count of currency that you submit. It's always a great idea that you make it known that that currency is also subject to inspection. We recommend depositing non-forensic currency. The Evidence Management Institute, one of the things that we recommend in our standards and best practices is that you deposit non-forensic currency in an institution instead of keeping it in a safe at your agency. There are parameters for that and guidance for that you can find on our website, but there is no good business reason for storing non-forensic, non-evidentiary value currency in a vault. It makes much more sense to deposit it. With respect to counterfeit currency, one of the things that I would just kind of suggest as guidance out there, the U.S. Secret Service, they actually want your counterfeit currency. Send it to them. That is the appropriate place to send counterfeit currency. They do a lot of analysis and investigation with that stuff. I have never talked to a Secret Service agent that has given me any guidance to the contrary. They use this stuff. They are the rightful authority to deal with counterfeit currency. They'll give it back to you if you're wrong. So use the Secret Service as a great resource for counterfeit currency. One of the other things I'll talk about is documentation. Anytime I would have as a policy at your agency that anytime currency is collected as evidence, and this doesn't matter if it's a search warrant or any other method, anytime money exchanges hands between an investigator, an officer, and anybody else, we recommend that you provide a receipt that gives due process information for returning that item. Providing a receipt for anything that you seize is a great practice, especially with respect to money, even found property. If an officer, I mean, we'll talk about that more when we talk about non-evidentiary property, but having an officer hand a wallet back to someone in the field and not document that and record that as property evidence, to me, just opens that officer to huge liability. We'll discuss that more when we discuss found property. Last couple of things with respect to just principles and practices. Typically, I like to treat foreign currency as forensic currency, because most we can't exchange. We don't know the exchange rates. We just keep that and deal with that as forensic currency. And if you're dealing with destroyed currency, maybe currency evidence that was involved in a fire or a flood, that stuff can be sent back to the Treasury Department, and they will reclaim that currency and send the repaired or reclaimed currency to the sender. When it comes to packaging and labeling, we recommend never packaging currency or coin in combination with any other item types. That your evidence label should indicate the total amount of currency or coin that has been submitted. I like to see labels with the name of the submitting officer and the verifying officer on the label. These things just cut down on issues tremendously. Again, we believe in sealing currency evidence and making sure that the procedures that you use for packaging currency and labeling currency and submitting currency are included in your evidence packaging manual. I mentioned, and I probably should have put this slide a little earlier in the presentation, talking about forensic currency and non-forensic currency. Basically, non-forensic currency, well, let's talk about forensic currency first. When I refer to forensic currency, I'm talking about currency or coin that is known to or believed to contain some type of probative forensic evidence, trace evidence like latent prints or chemical evidence or DNA evidence. If it's known or believed to link any subject based on serial number, if you've got buy bust money that is linked by serial number, that is forensic currency, because it is a nexus between this bill that can be documented and linked that was found with this person, or currency with higher value than the denomination on the face, like antique coins. I don't know anything about antique coins, but let's say you find a penny that for some reason, because it was screwed up when they made it, is now worth $1,000. Well, we don't want to deposit that as a penny, because the bank will take it as a penny. So high value, higher than face value currency, we're gonna retain as forensic currency. Non-forensic currency is everything else. It's all the cash and all the coins that come into you that's not going to contain trace. It's not going to contain DNA. It's not linked to a serialized case. It's a penny. Deposit it. It's much better than storing it. We also recommend a couple last things with respect to currency before we move on. It is really important that you collect the person information from whom the currency was seized, or if it was seized from someone, the owner. These are two critical components. Currency is always going to be disposed of by giving it back to somebody. And if we don't know who the somebody that it belongs to is, it's very difficult to get that back to them. So that happens on the front end of the process. It's really important that your officers obtain that information early on. We recommend storing currency under separate storage under high security. Just like all of these other evidence types, that's going to be a common theme. We also recommend the deposit of non-forensic currency There's no compelling business reason to put a bunch of non-forensic currency in your vaults and let it stack up over time. There's just no compelling reason to do that. When it comes to currency evidence disposition, if it returns to owner, obviously we're going to recommend a receipt. If it's converted to the state or state use, that needs to happen usually by virtue of a court order in most jurisdictions. I just can't see any jurisdiction that would do otherwise. If I could be wrong, but currency disposition usually requires some type of court order unless it's being returned to a known owner and you're authorized by statute. You have anything on currency, James?
Yeah, well, in California, can you hear me? I'm not sure if you
Yes.
guys can hear me. In California, we don't necessarily have a court order to disposition currency unless it was taken under a search warrant, obviously. Then we'd request court order for all the items that we're getting rid of. But I think everything's on point. I'm glad you brought up the fact that buy money has serialized and you consider that forensic evidence. I appreciate that because that would have been one of my picks for the sixth reason. But we did have a couple questions I wanted to bring up to you regarding foreign currency. And when foreign currency is no longer needed, that goes unclaimed, what are some options for getting rid of that?
You know, that's foreign currency is tricky. I mean, if it's unclaimed and there's no known owner, we can't get it back to an owner, and it's authorized to be converted to the city's general fund, which is generally the place where those types of funds will go. Then you would need to find a financial institution that will convert the money or exchange the money. Most banks will do this. Because we're really not worried at that point about the exchange rate or returning. I mean, it's coming to the state, so whatever
Right.
that value is, it's going to be that value.
It's going to cheap.
It's a little different than returning it to a citizen or an owner because they are entitled to the value of the item at the time that it was taken or the actual item. So that would be the wrinkle there.
Yeah, and obviously in government code, at least in California, I'm not familiar with laws throughout the nation, but in California, if the money is being deposited into an interest-bearing account, then the owners are entitled to whatever interest it's accrued during that time it's been.
And that's a good point to bring up. Almost every jurisdiction that I'm aware of, if there is interest that accrues, I should probably put that in the slide. It might be in the notes that we recommend depositing non-forensic currency in a non-interest bearing account for that reason. I mean, just because you don't want to be involved in the process of figuring out the billionth of a cent that you earned as a result of that and how to return that fraction to someone. But there will be someone that asks for that. So we'll move on real quick to firearms. There's not a lot to talk about with respect to firearms. I mean, all of these special processes, you'll find similar themes. Firearms, currency, drugs, we want to store them under higher security than we do general evidence. Firearms, there's a couple little different wrinkles. We'll try to hit those. When I'm talking about firearms, I'm referring to something that meets the definition of a firearm in Title 18 of the U.S. Code, Chapter 44, Section 921. Basically a gun. So all that to say, we're talking about guns here. Long guns, handguns, shotguns. With respect to evidence and firearms evidence and dealing with this as evidence, there's a couple of important things that I'd like to point out at the beginning. Evidence management personnel are not always sworn, so there are a lot of agencies where evidence management functions are handled by civilians. We make the erroneous assumption sometime that everyone was grown up in Texas in a gun culture like me, where I had a gun at 4 years old and grew up with guns, was comfortable with guns, and I was a police officer and shot them and learned to shoot them and did all kinds of shooting things. But our civilians don't get the same type of training. So it is extremely important, extremely critical that all evidence management personnel should receive documented training related to firearm safety, how to handle them safely, how to properly identify firearm make, model, caliber, finish, and serial number, and how to visually confirm that an item or that a firearm has been submitted visibly safe and unloaded. That training is critical for the safety of the people in your unit it is also critical for actually working around and working with firearms for everyone and making sure that we get the right information documented. So when it comes to firearms packaging and labeling, this is we teach that everything needs to be packaged, labeled, and sealed. Firearms, we will make an exception because there is a wrinkle to farm submission that we recommend, we think is a good idea. So those can be submitted unsealed. That needs to be documented in your packaging manual because we want to confirm that they have been submitted visibly safe and unloaded condition. And we also want to verify the serial number of that weapon. So that is why we allow or provide a provision to allow serial or firearms to be submitted. One, so we can make sure they're safe and they're not going to go boom. And two, so we can verify the serial number that's been entered. I can tell you from personal experience, we have had evidence submitted, firearm evidence submitted. The wrong serial number was recorded. The wrong serial number was run through NCIC or TCIC. And when we didn't confirm the serial number when it was entered. So 20 years later, I'm opening this box. I run the thing on NCIC. It comes up stolen 20 years ago. That's one of the reasons why we want to verify serial numbers and also verify that items have been submitted visibly safe. Believe it or not, some cops will submit guns loaded for no reason. And we want to make
It
sure that they
happens.
don't do that. I mean, it can happen. And sometimes you have to submit firearms that are loaded. If you've got a weapon that was involved in a homicide that was thrown into a pond and recovered by a dive team, well, that weapon is going to be placed basically in a tin can in that water, the same solution that it was found in, oftentimes until it can be taken to a forensic lab and analyzed by a forensic examiner, whether they're ballistics or chemical or whatever they do. But that item is going to be loaded. There's no good way to unload that. There's no forensically appropriate way to unload it in the field or even in a property room. So that there are exceptions. We believe that firearms should be packaged and stored in a manner that is going to prevent damage or alteration to the firing pin, muzzle, barrel interior, or anything that might be used, any component that might be used for forensic analysis or comparison. I hate seeing wire zip ties shoved down the barrels of pistols in evidence rooms because those wires can make tool marks, and tool marks can alter the impression that the ballistic comparison is going to draw from that item. So when it comes to submission and intake, we recommend three things: submitted unloaded, made visibly safe, run through NCIC or TCIC or whatever your CIC is in your state. I guess in North Carolina, NCCIC. That's fun. But make sure it's run to be checked for stole through a computer device. I just lost my train of thought. But make sure that you check that thing to make sure that it's not stolen. I can't tell you how many times it's happened that there have been stolen firearms that could have been returned to their owner years ago, but they weren't run through NCIC. They just sat on a shelf, unfound, unsolved, and unloved for many years. We also recommend verifying serial numbers on all firearm submissions because of that. I mean, serial numbers, firearms are one of the few serialized items that there is a chance that someone might know their serial number. I know the serial number on my service pistol to this day. I could tell you that from rote. I can't tell you that about my truck, my motorcycle, my whatever, this iPhone, which I dearly love. I still can't tell you the serial number. But serial numbers and firearms, people know those and people obtain those and people can get that information. So when you're documenting firearm, we recommend drop-down menus, controlled access menus, because police officers can spell and misspell the word Glock, the word Winchester, Smith and Wesson, any number of ways. And there are relatively few makes and models of firearms that can all be put in a drop-down menu. That's why we recommend controlled fields. And when it comes to firearms evidence storage, we recommend, again, separate storage environment. We also recommend that firearms should be stored in a temperature controlled environment. And if you'll remember from our discussion last week, temperature controlled means between 60 degrees and 75 degrees Fahrenheit, lower than 60% humidity. Even lower would be better for storing firearms because they are metal and they will rust.
Yep.
When it comes to firearms disposition, and we will probably end our discussion this week at disposition. Next week, we'll probably talk about audits, inspections, and inventories,
Yep.
and dope. So this is really just a way of keeping you coming back for more, hopefully. But we recommend, if you're going to physically destroy firearms, that they're destroyed to the standard established by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. They are the appropriate legal authority to establish firearms destruction. They make a publication that I don't have on my website, but I will look for that and I will try to publish that on our website. But they spell out, if you're going to physically destroy an item, the requirements, the torch cuts, the what it takes to render a firearm destroyed, technically and legally by the letter of the law. If you can have somebody else do it, obviously have them do it. But we'll make that recommendation. When we talk about firearm storage, and I think I just went back there. Again, disposition items, all disposition items should be stored under higher security. Disposition of firearms should involve two people to witness and verify that disposition. These are true of all dispositions. They're especially true of firearms. And you should not mark them destroyed or disposed until they're destroyed or disposed. Those are critical components. Now, there are jurisdictions out there, there are states that require the auction of disposed firearms. If you are in a jurisdiction like that, I feel for you, because I can see why you wouldn't want to auction off a firearm related to a criminal case, because chances are that firearm could be used in another criminal case and come back to you, and then they're going to ask you, hey agency, why did you auction this firearm? Well, because we had to. But if you have to do it, make sure that that you have a policy and a procedure and a response prepared if those things are used in subsequent criminal offenses. Have the reason and rationale worked out ahead of time so that you're not caught on your heels. Um, this, for me, one of the fun things, for forensic ballistic labs, I know there was a time in my life when I had a weird affinity for guns and I couldn't stand seeing them cut up or destroyed. I apologize. I've learned since. But I would donate my firearms to a state firearms ballistic lab, because they would take all the guns, and they wanted Raven Arms 25s because people use Raven Arms 25s in crimes. They don't necessarily use beautiful, Kimbers all the time. So
Mhm.
those labs are a great resource for disposition, and they can use it. They can use it. And there are also vendors out there that provide secure destruction services for you at no cost. I know that LSC is one out of Nevada.
Las Vegas,
Gunbusters is another
Missouri.
organization that does Missouri. Yeah, and Gunbusters has people all over the country that work in satellite locations. So check those out as well. I think similar to last week, we're going to end our discussion here. We'll do drug evidence next week. Again, this is the first class we've ever done online, so we're not sure about what the pacing would be, but it's 3:01. I want to cut things off at 3 o'clock, or hold it close to an hour as we can, so that these training sessions are an hour long. I realize that that's going to create some confusion from the original labels on the, now totally drawn a blank, and because my attention span expires in exactly 60 minutes. So that might be another factor, another reason. But we want to use the last 30 minutes to answer questions. And if you've got questions and James can see them,
Yeah,
uh, we'll spend some Q&A time, and we'll talk about drug evidence next week. If you were here only for drug evidence, I apologize profusely. Come back next week. It'll be the first item on the docket.
sure. Sure. We do have a couple questions left. Derek, I just responded to your question regarding who should be responsible for investigating found property, which I've posted and made sure that everyone can see it, hopefully. Brittany is asking, does anyone have a currency policy or procedure that they'd be interested in sharing with her clerk's office? We do not have a policy in place. Everything stays in my vault. And come retention time, I have about $400 ready to destroy, but we don't know exactly what to do with it, depositing or otherwise. That's a great question, Brittany, and that's exactly where we're at today. So if anyone wants to reach out, I think it's just developing a process for that, establishing an account either with your court or us cheating to your state is typically the way most agencies process disposition currency.
And I have I've got a resource that I could post on on the client site. It's something that I use during my 2-day class. It's basically it's a currency policy. It could be used as a model currency policy if you're interested in looking at dispositions. It is predisposed to deposit currency. So if that's not the direction that you're headed, the language of this thing is designed to kind of be a model policy for currency deposits. If you don't see it on our website, email me directly. I can send a copy of that to you. If you're interested in that, that can be, hopefully that could be a resource for you as well.
Yeah, and Gary from West Virginia says that, oh, I'm sorry, Willie, I'm sorry, says they use the state treasurer for disposal of currency and for auctions as well. So that's great to hear that. Interest. Do you have to pay the interest when you release the money? Gary Tucker's asking that question. Typically, we don't see that side of it. It's usually a financial entity that handles the cash release. So that's a good reason to get rid of it. Wash it away out of your hands and let another entity get rid of it. If it's in your unit, no, you won't have to pay interest on that because it's been sitting in your evidence vault the entire time, not bearing any interest at all. Anything to add to that, Sean?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why most drug seizures, I mean, agencies have a specific seizure account established for drug seizure funds, and most agencies follow the paradigm of that account is non-interest bearing. I would have the same type of account for currency that's going to be returned or currency that's deposited that could be returned back to the owner for the same reason. Lawfully, they're entitled to it. Now, there are some agencies that take the position of, well, if they ask for it, we'll give it back to them. But I really believe, I mean, in transparent government and in open government and doing the right thing for the right reasons. So to me, it makes much more sense not to collect interest on the money. Uh, and if you do the right thing and return the interest with the money. I mean, you've used their money, it's theirs. You're giving it back to them. You're acknowledging that it's their money. So it's important to give it back to them. That's why I don't like to see interest bearing accounts, because it makes it more difficult to do the right thing.
Absolutely.
Here's a good question by Kathleen. I don't know if you've responded. If you're dealing with a case where the officer or detective is no longer with the agency, who do you go to for disposition? And that happens many, 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 many times and many times over. What I would
Yeah.
recommend is that you have in place as a part of your policy or procedure, if you've got evidence that's coming that's eligible for disposal, who do you go to for that disposition? I recommend placing in policy someone that makes sense, like the supervisor, a sergeant over investigations, or a detective sergeant, some type of supervisory position that will be responsible, a position that will be responsible for those types of things, regardless of who fills the position.
Right.
But you need to have that kind of established in policy. It's going to be the sergeant of a sergeant in the investigative bureau will be responsible for dispositions for retired or fired officer cases.
Yeah, a lot of times we'll just send over the blanket authorizations for all those folks that are transferred on or retired, and we'll send them to the investigator aide. She could do the workup on them because she'll have access. He or she will have access to all the information on the case, and then she could submit those as a one lump sum item to the sergeant for final review. So that's a great question.
Yeah. Got one question about the philosophy behind counting currency turned in by officers. And the concern here is basically related to liability. Once it's open post submission, that the liability would lean towards the person that opened the package. I agree, Russell, that is a possibility.
Yeah.
But our goal here is accuracy and transparency as an agency. I'm not talking about, I mean, on one side of the lockers or the other side of the lockers, I mean, we're all under the umbrella of the same agency. And it's the agency's responsibility to be accurate with respect to that submission. You know, whether it's the officer or the evidence custodian, the prime goal, the prime directive is accuracy that the agency's records are accurate. So that's why we believe in counting and verifying prior to, so that when you do open the package on the other side, it increases the likelihood that the counted and verified amount is going to be the same on both sides of the locker or when it comes time to deposit it.
Yeah, and if I could just add a little bit to that, Russell, you know, a lot of times, every time that we do a cash release, we've always, if we have a threshold amount of $1,000, we always take 2 people from our unit as a witness to that. Then another thing you could do is only in front of the person receiving the funds would you open the item in a separate location other than the original seal, just like your typical evidence breach of the package. And that way, if there is a count that's off, you can at least show that it was open for the very first time since it came into your custody in front of the owner, and you had a witness, and we're even on camera at the time we do that. So we tried to do the whole trifecta to ensure that every element of our unit is covered. Not to point blame or something towards the person that booked it in, but just to cover yourselves, because the last thing you want is an investigation of your evidence unit.
Right. And I would just kind of add one, my preference is that especially if you deposit funds, I mean, one, you want to make those deposits fairly routinely, weekly, so that those mistakes are caught early and often. But my preference would be the officer that submits the evidence and the verifying officer submit that currency. They both attest to the amount that has been submitted. They seal it up, submit it to the evidence custodian, and that evidence custodian, for me, I don't know why they would ever unseal that and re-verify it on the other side of the lockers. That keeps the evidence custodian out of the loop. And then when it goes to be deposited, if there is a discrepancy, obviously that would be something that you would have to deal with from there. But my preference would be that chain of custody, that physical chain of custody, that physical manifestation and evidence seal of chain of custody remains pristine. The officer puts it in the locker, it's sealed. You take it out, it's still sealed. You put it in the vault, it's sealed. When it's time to give it to somebody else, you pull it out, same exact seal. When you open it the first time, everyone sees that seal has remained intact. Uh, that just makes that's just good evidence movement practices to me.
Absolutely.
Let's see. You see any other questions, James?
Dana said that their agency, they added a step for out processing for all their officers so that they'll have to review evidence before they separate. Anything left gets reassigned to officer supervisor. So I think that's a great catch-all. If you want to leave to retire or go on to another agency, then just make sure all your evidence is signed off. Well, I guess the only exception would be is if you left under unfavorable circumstances. Then would have to obviously be assigned, a caseload would be assigned to someone else. But that's a great process.
That's a genius idea. Was that Dana Kelly?
Yes.
Yeah, that's smart. I mean, I'm not gonna stop the recording because I'm gonna go type that into my lesson plan.
Awesome.
So,
awesome.
But if that is it, yeah, that's a great idea to have that as a part of your out processing. Where they don't get their final check until they give you the dispositions.
I'm sure they'll expedite that to you.
That is a thing of beauty right there. So I think that's all the questions we have this week. If you have more questions, email me at sean@evidencemanagement.com, or James. I don't want to give out your personal email, so I won't.
Yeah, no worries.
But email me if you got a question for James. I'll forward it to James gladly. But thank you for being here. Thank you for paying attention. This is the end of the Q&A section of what we were talking about today. Next week, we'll talk about drug evidence, and we'll also talk about audits, inventories, and inspections.
Right.
So we should be able to get caught up completely. And when we edit this thing in post, I'm going to make myself thinner and make it look like we covered everything in an hour. So have a great week. Thank you for being here. We appreciate your time. Again, if you have questions, please contact us. Go check out that Facebook Evidence Management Community Forum if you want to find out from your peers solutions or advice. So
good stuff. Good stuff. Everyone have a great weekend. Take care.
I'll see you, James. Take care.